Hey, welcome to part two of Hollie McKay's interview about Guantanamo Bay. Hollie, in this interview, the subject of your article is about the fact that this base, which has been there operating in this way for 22 years, has become its own little world and its own little community. And but it does more than that. And the question of whether or not to shut down Guantanamo, which comes up in the news, is that really a question of the shutting down Guantanamo, the facility, or shutting down Guantanamo, the prison?
I think we talk a lot about, it tends to get conflated. And so Guantanamo Bay is really just sort of this emergence of very myth and mayhem, and it's got a very dark cloud around it. And I think we talk about closing Guantanamo and forget that it's actually a naval base where a lot of American military personnel are actually stationed. So generally, when we are looking at Guantanamo, we are looking at sort of closing the prison facility, which costs an astronomical amount of money, several million a year to house each detainee there, which if you compare to how much it costs to house a person in a maximum security prison in the U.S., which I believe is around $75,000. So there's a massive discrepancy there. And of course, that is a big call of controversy. And with that, Cubans are obviously very upset about the idea of Americans sort of occupying this island that belongs to them in this sort of lease that has no end to it. So that is an entirely sort of separate debate where people believe that the land should be given back to the Cubans and that it's sort of rightfully theirs. So there is a smaller argument and then a larger argument that covers that. So it is a very sort of interesting place, and that's one of the reasons I sort of wanted to go to see what was really happening there. So it is a little bit of a process as a civilian. You have to go through a huge amount of paperwork. You have to get really in depth with your backgrounds and pass all those sort of checks, and then there really just is one commercial airliner that goes in and out of Guantanamo Bay each week. Typically, on a Saturday, it leaves from Andrews Air Base in Maryland and goes to Guantanamo back, and then picks up whoever's leaving and heads back. So once you get there, you are really kind of stuck there for at least a week, and it's sort of an interesting place. It's compared to most of the military bases that I've ever been on, and this includes in war zones from Kabul to Baghdad. There was a lot of paranoia that I sort of sensed that I didn't even sense in an active war zone. So, there was a lot of sort of checking that none of the photographs, even if they weren't going to be posted, that journalists took, they were all subject to operational security. There was just a lot of protocol. We had to wear badges around our necks the whole time. And I think, that is sort of in many ways a deterrent to make sure that nobody sort of comes up to you and starts talking and says anything that could be misconstrued or inappropriate. But what I found to be a little bit frustrating, I think, was the sort of lack of access to Camp X-Ray and to where the detainees are held. And that area of Guantanamo is run by JTF, Joint Task Force, and it used to be back in the day that they were quite open about allowing journalists and people from the outside to be able to go and to see these facilities, and now it always just sort of seems to be a blanket no. And I think that is not doing justice to the American taxpayer who is paying, for this detention facility. But at the same time, what that does is creates a sort of a shadow of doubt in people's minds that are nefarious things happening. And I think that's why we see so many sort of stories that are very painted in this sort of very nebulous light around Guantanamo. And I think that's because a lot of the time, when you aren't permitted that access, a lot of journalists sort of take away that what they will, and that is that something must be there to be hidden. And I don't necessarily think that is the case anymore. I think certainly the days of black sites and enhanced interrogation are long gone, but the lack of transparency, in my purview as a journalist, that would be something that I really do think that the DoD has to address.
is that something that the DoD can address, or is this such a multi-agency morass at this point of layer upon layer upon layer that there essentially isn't anyone who is in authority to address it?
I mean, I do think that at the end of the day, someone has to take responsibility for that, and that is the Southern Command, which is oversees the JTF at Guantanamo Bay, and the buck should stop with them. As I said, it was up until 2019 that access was fairly free reign for a lot of journalists, and that just hasn't been the case since then. And I don't think that does any service to what is happening on that island. And I think that, again, we as taxpayers should have a little bit of a greater sense to what is going on. And I think without that, that is sort of opens the door to a lot of questions and speculation that probably doesn't exist.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and the rest of the facility, tropical paradise?
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't sure what to expect, to be honest. But it's very much a base. It's sort of a small town that doesn't really feel like a small town. There are several bars and restaurants, and sort of an outdoor movie theater, and a few things where people try to have something of a normal life. Remember that a lot of sailors and Marines, and in some cases their families and contractors too, are brought there, and then they spend many months of their lives there. So there is sort of some efforts to try to make it appear a little bit homely, but I think that's always really hard when it's a military base. You've got one exchange where people can do their shopping at. There is a souvenir shop, which people can take home a Guantanamo Bay no bad days hat or t-shirt or mug. So that is sort of a staple of that. Yeah, I think bases are always interesting places to be, but I certainly, again, take my hat off to people that have to spend long deployments in these places, because it certainly it can come with a claustrophobic feeling, I think, and there's always something always a little bit dark, when you look outside your window and everything is sort of barbed wire, even when you've got this vast ocean. And there is a really beautiful ocean in several beaches that people go to, and beautiful warm water, and some snorkeling and scuba diving and a few sort of activities like that. But it is this strange sort of base in the middle of what certainly could be a tropical paradise.
Yeah. Well, I read your article as you were describing it, and it actually reminded me of the naval base at Subic Bay in the Philippines, and with very, very many of the same features from the 1960s. So it's my impression of it was a place caught in a capsule of time of the end of American colonialism, and it's still there, notwithstanding the prison portion, which is really a post 2000 type thing. But the rest of your description, yeah, it actually struck me as the type of place that would have been familiar to people in the era of American colonies, and we haven't given that up yet either. It was a very fascinating article. I found it a fascinating read. I think people will too. And thank you, Hollie, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Dennis.